wanted to dive straight in because we don't have a huge amount of time for this session. There is a lot to discuss around this topic. So, Ishan, I think one of the first things we should perhaps talk about when we speak about digital assessment is distinguishing between digital assessment and remote proctoring as not being exactly the same thing.
Yeah, morning, Alistair. Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. I think that is a really important distinction. Prior to the pandemic, lots of people were thinking about digital assessment and implementing it at their institution, mainly on the basis of having digital assessment with people doing exams on site, either using computers belonging to the institution or people bringing their own device. The pandemic has probably shifted that a little bit because people had to pivot to digital assessment during the pandemic, suiting the conditions they were in, which meant, it sounds trite, but it's true, not being able to use their facilities. And so a lot of digital assessment became remote proctoring. And I think in some people's minds, the two things are now somewhat conflated. The reality is that post-pandemic, in whatever shape that looks, people will do assessments on site again, at which point you won't need to remote proctor because you'd have people in the room to do that. So when people are thinking about digital assessment, it's that broader piece of it being digital assessment. Doesn't mean that it's an exam, doesn't mean that it's remote proctored necessarily. That's one of several options you've got. I can envisage a world where a lot of people do digital assessments using their own device on site at their institution. And remote proctoring is something that's used as an option where someone's unable to come to that site, either for physical reasons or locatively, the candidate who needs to retake an assessment or has to defer one and now has moved back to the country that they came from before they came to study. So there are very different things there, and digital assessment is far broader than just simply this idea of remote proctoring.
Great, thank you. And I mean, of course, Inspera has been working with university partners on digital assessment for a lot longer than just the past 14 months or so. But I was wondering if you could tell us how digital assessment has changed in the past year and what do you think the future implications are for assessment practices in higher education? Are there certain trends you've seen emerge? Do you think it's a classic case of people will keep some of the changes that have been forced upon them, but not all of them?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things there. What's been the greatest change? I think it's twofold. If we look pre-pandemic, a lot of people thought of digital assessment as something that was a nice to have that they'd get round to, but they could almost certainly think of other projects and other enhancements that they want to make first. The pandemic almost certainly shifted that conversation to, well, I've got to do something now. And people, absolute credit to everyone in the higher education community because they have pivoted quickly to solutions that allowed their students to progress and to graduate and to move on to whatever they wanted to do. How much will we keep? Well, I think the bit we will keep is the idea that digital assessment needs to be part of every higher education institution's armory. Does that mean that tomorrow that they will do all of their exams digitally and not use pen and paper again? No, I don't think that's going to be the case everywhere. I think there are some institutions who'll see that as something that they want to achieve quite quickly. But what we'll keep is, I think, that rate of progress, certainly, for one. Secondly, what we'll keep is almost the intrigue that the learning technologist community, the learning and teaching community, the senior management communities across these institutions have for now using something that can not only help them when they can't physically have people in, if we do find that we have lockdowns in the future, but also that intrigue to see that they can assess in very different ways. It always seems something of a strange situation that we have VLEs that allow people to learn digitally, but then all too often we say, okay, but to finish this module off, you need to go and sit in a cold gym hall for 3 hours with a pen and paper, which is not what you've done so far. So I think people will look at the fact that they can use digital tools, that they can get their students using Office 365, for example, that they use every day as part of their assessments in an exam setting. Because of course they do that in other forms of assessment with courseworks, people are doing that already, but in exam mode, if that's what you need to do. I think the third and final change is that we'll see people reevaluating their exams. Does this need to be an exam? Or is this an exam because it's always been an exam? There are so many assessment vehicles out there, which again, those communities that I mentioned know really well, that could be used. And often I think it's the fact that the modality of people doing a final exam on paper in an exam hall, that has inhibited that change. But with digital tools through digital assessment available to them, there's a wide range of possibilities. I would love to see the institutions where they say, here's a huge menu of options, which not only are possibilities, but they're things that will support you with. Here are the tools that let you do it. So for creative faculty out there, they can look at this menu and say, yeah, I can go do that. I can assess in a different way, and there's great support for it.
To your last point about offering that menu of options, we've heard a lot over the past day or so about the future of personalized learning and how it's so important in order to accommodate different types of learners for myriad reasons. Are we now looking at also personalized assessment alongside that? Does that need to be a consideration?
I would hope so. I think that maybe one of the reasons why we haven't had it in the past is what's been there in terms of available options to personalize and the amount of support that people can have. I don't think it's for a want of thinking of personalized options, or indeed, I don't think it's for a want of faculty and institutions wanting to offer that. I think they do, absolutely. But it's harder to offer a menu of options. It's harder to say to a student, you can pick from one of these as your way of being assessed. I think it's also harder for students because the norm, the one that everyone's used to, the one that there's most support for, would almost certainly end up being the one that's picked the most. Uh, I suspect anyone listening would realize I probably prefer speaking to writing. I would have really welcomed the opportunity, where appropriate, during my um, educational career, going back through university and earlier, to have that option to be able to present rather than write. But it's a burden, and the burden only gets alleviated or ameliorated if there are tools to support people to do that, and that's support all the way across. So faculty, administrators, and those students having that support to confidently pick from a series of options to give them that personalized assessment experience.
The other thing we've seen a lot of in the past year has been the innovation that's been driven by faculty, administrators, and other university staff. I mean, there's been a bottom-up approach to changing and modernizing universities as much as there have been things that have decided at a policy level by leaders. What are the type of cultural transitions that you're seeing with your university partners when obviously you may have some hugely innovative teaching staff and some administrators who absolutely want to modernize, but it's about taking a joined up approach across that institution, isn't it?
It is. And I think that digital transformation, of course, is easier on those who are digitally literate and interested in technology. That's fine, but there'll always be people who don't have that. I mean, I'm an unashamed techie, but I, at the same time, fully recognize there's people for whom this isn't interesting. I think it's about finding the benefits for people rather than necessarily talking about the technology. Even when prior to working at Inspera, I worked at a university and implemented Inspera. And I think that one of the things I was able to say to people who perhaps weren't as interested in the tech as I was, well, let's look at, for example, the benefit in feedback. If you have a digital assessment platform and you enter your feedback while you mark on the platform, well, students can log in and see that feedback. We get rid of having to write it separately in a document, the operational cost of you doing that, then an administrator having to securely mail it out or put it onto the VLE or in some way be part of a massive machine to do what should be a fairly simple task. And I think it's making sure that everyone feels included and at the same time really addressing people's fears or concerns or them really pointing out where things will change. I mean, I always think that there's a ball of work that has to be done for everything, and marking assessments is no different to anything else. and you can push that ball around. But ultimately, that ball of work has to be done by people. And what you might do by implementing a digital tool is change who's doing it. And that may well cause concerns for people saying, well, that didn't used to be my job. They may see that on a macro level, this actually benefits everyone. They may not. I think the other part to it is that, as part of this sort of helping people through this transition, is also not being entirely prescriptive about how you make people do things. If we take the idea of digital marking, there are some people who are very wedded to using a red, green, and blue pen. And I understand that, having done that, having been faculty. So rather than saying, well, look, you can't do it any other way other than just marking on screen, that's it. It's saying to people, well, look, that's the end state. Your marks and your feedback need to be on screen. How you get there is a matter for you. If you're more comfortable the first few times printing it off, marking it on paper, then putting it on screen, that is going to take you longer. But let's not lose that. Let's actually have sight of the goal that we're trying to achieve rather than micromanaging every process in between, because that's going to put people off. And we look at some of our partners in Scandinavia who've been doing this for far longer. One of our partners in Scandinavia, they did exactly that. They said, you mark how you wish, as long as those marks and the feedback ends up on screen. And with the ones who wanted to print them out, they did. And over time, they saw that actually they could mark this on screen pretty quickly, pretty easily. And so they did, and they stopped printing it off. And that was the journey that they went on by themselves. It's no different to any other part of learning. You sometimes just have to have a go and see where it takes you to get to that goal state.
We've had quite a few questions come in from the audience already. I'm keen to sort of try and weave those in as we go along the way.
Yeah.
A couple of them have been about dealing with professional bodies and PSRBs, which I think we knew were going to come up at some point. Somebody was asked. These have to do with, how do you match the, does this need an exam mentality, and how do you mitigate pressures from PSRBs to have an exam in those cases? And also, how can you perhaps work more closely with professional accreditation editors to encourage them to embrace innovation and not take a blocking aspect to sort of saying no to trying different modes of assessment?
Okay, so let's take both of those, and I'll take them in turn. So with PSRBs, again, in my previous role, I worked at a university where almost all of the exams were accredited by a PSRB or in some way affected by a PSRB. And they've taken a fairly unified approach over the last 14 months, which is our exams are exams. And if you want to run them, you've got to proctor them. And if you proctor them, they have to be on site. And if you can't be on site, then you have to remote proctor them. And that's that. In terms of changing them from exams, in terms of getting rid of proctoring or remote proctoring, wherever it may be, I think it's working with PSRBs to, in the same way as an institution might reflect on why they have exams, finding out what their rationale is. And I say finding out as a first step because I think some PSRBs will stick with exams forever. That will be their way of assessing because they will decide that there's no other form of assessment that they're willing to accept. If that's the case, then I think that the energy within an institution is on finding the best way of operationalizing those, be it remote proctoring or be it on site with proctors, but still using a computer. My experience of a number of PSRBs is that they're very open to using computers. Some of them have been doing it for a very long time already. So it sort of weaves into that second question about them blocking is talk to them about what you want to do and involve vendors like me. I have spoken to PSRBs in conjunction with institutions to say, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. Open, honest conversations like that. And I think that when you demystify some of what this is and what it does, people who have resistance to digital assessment, be they a PSRB or an institution or an individual, often just need to see under the hood. They need to see what it does, what it doesn't do, and what the experience is like for students and administrators and for faculty, and to perhaps remove some of the misconceptions that they may have. There's always concerns about, well, how can people get around the system? How can people in some way cheat if that's what they're going to do? Well, there's two parts to that. Show people what can be done to stop them. But secondly, also reference it back to what happened before. It is all too easy, particularly with technology and with applications, to almost sort of norm reference the past as perfect. Nothing went wrong in the past. And now we've got this and there's lots of scary new things. Well, no, what we did in the past was mitigate as far as we could instances of people not doing what they were supposed to in an assessment. In a digital world, we do the same thing. The potential threats might be different. There's some similarities. Our ability to mitigate will always be to mitigate. And making sure that everyone understands that and sees what the tools are, I think, is a secret to actually being able to innovate. So involve people, show them what happens, and they'll, most of the time, my experience has been that a number of their objections fall away when they just understand it a little better.
Great. We've had someone who picks up on a term that you used prior, which is the the ball of work that needs to be done by people. And the question is, can auto graders and/or peer marking drastically reduce this ball of work that needs to be done?
It can. Yeah, there's an example of where you can make the ball of work smaller. So auto marking will. Now, how will it do that? We traditionally think of multiple choice questions. That's the easiest space, but there is increasingly the ability to use auto marking with words and numbers. Uh, the amount of work that it reduces, yeah, it will. If we think about auto marking words, that's fine, but you have to think of the new challenges that come, which is that, for example, you need to tell the system what the answers are. You need to decide which misspellings of words you're going to accept. You need to realize that you will, for QA purposes, need to go back through it, and you will need to check that that there aren't good answers that you hadn't thought of that the system has missed. So yeah, it's making that ball a little bit smaller. At the same time, someone has to write the question still, which you had to do before. You have to still put in those answers. So that ball of work overall is a little bit smaller, but there is still some work there for people to do. So, for example, writing the question. In the past, someone would have written the question, but they wouldn't have had to think about writing the answer key to auto mark. That tiny bit of the ball of work, who's doing that? Is there a mismatch in expectations as to who's being involved in that? I think ultimately, when you think of the ball of work, it's about making sure that you have got the appropriate people doing the appropriate tasks based on their skill, knowledge, and experience. And they may not agree with you when you come up with that. They might say, well, no, this is a job for someone completely different. But if we take things like question papers, I have a really clear view that the faculty are experts on this. It really is their job. They will get support doing it. But if I want to be sure of quality assurance, I want a member of faculty being the last person to sign off on an exam paper, which means that they need to go into the system, look at it and say, yeah, I am content that that looks right. That's a little bit of the ball of work.
Right. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to keep firing them at you, I'm afraid.
Sure.
We'll have to go for it. There was one more general question about the cultural shift that we discussed. It said it's clear from this chat that the understanding of what digital assessment is or what it could be is confused. HEIs do need product teams to match student needs to the growing number of edtech solutions. Is it time for universities to change their approach?
Do you know, I think generally, I think that it's time for universities maybe to broaden their approach. I agree with the premise of the question that it is time to have product teams in universities who look on that far broader scale at what technology could do for them. So broadening rather than changing, because I think there's still within HEIs, there's a lot of really good residual knowledge about technology and process. But yeah, mapping it to what students now want, to what solutions can provide, and mindful we've got more questions and I'm going to keep these shorter. The idea that so many products out there now do multiple things. If you look at something, it's growing and growing and growing. Really, what is that correct product fit for you in the different areas that you have?
Okay, great. I'm going to conflate a couple because we've had two questions about video assessment and whether you think that can form part of the new offering that people put together for students, and also whether they should play a more formal part of assessment at all levels, not just with PhDs.
Yeah, I think so. I think that Vivas or video assessments or people having a discussion, I think they're a great form of assessment where questions traditionally would lead markers to think, oh my goodness, if only I could ask you just a little bit more to really understand whether you've just parroted back something or whether you really get this, or allow you to actually take the granularity between students and say they've all said the same thing, but I wonder who knows just one stage more. So yes, I think they'll play a bigger part. And I think they'll play a bigger part if the technology makes it easier for people to do it. That is one of our next products. It's the ability to, within the system, video someone and mark them and have that video sitting there for the second marker and the moderator and external examiner. So yeah, we see it as a huge opportunity, but only if it's made easy for people to do, not if they have to arrange 6 Teams calls and have 9 different PDFs open and then mark it on a Word document and then put it all on SharePoint and then hope for the best. Let's make that simple, then it'll happen.
I think it's probably worth flagging that when I've heard other leaders speak about this, they've said that obviously the video assessment isn't can take different forms and formats too. So, for example, if you are observing a practical exam for a STEM course or a skills-based course, it's useful to be able to slow down and focus in on certain points so that you can pinpoint assessment, and also that process can be used as a training, very much like you would revise with a mock paper from an old pen and paper style exam. You can get students used to working in that way, so they are used to observing themselves and they lose a lot of the self-consciousness that they might have if the very first interaction they have is some kind of video assessment.
Yeah, it can't be the first assessment. I mean, this fits nicely in the wheelhouse of what I used to teach. My first career, I was a barrister. I then taught on the bar exams, and you spend a year as a student being videoed doing pieces of advocacy, and you're told that you need to watch yourself, do that, watch back what you did. So when you actually get to the assessment and you then are videoed, it really isn't a problem. So yeah, you can't begin with a video assessment. It's got to be part of that. That ramp up to a summative assessment. And again, if you've got the technology to assess it, you've got the technology for them to use it as well as part of their learning, so that it seems entirely normal when they get to that assessment. So it can't just be there sitting at the end.
Great, thank you. There's another question you've had about open assessment, which the person in the audience defines as students decide with their tutors what form their assessments will take to show their fulfillment of the learning outcomes and play to their personal strengths. I suppose that goes back to a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about the idea of personalized assessment, and that you within that have a feedback loop between students and tutors in order to find what is going to get the optimal outcomes for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I think people, if you ask people blankly, would you like that? The answer is going to be yes, because people would believe that they do better given the choice of being able to demonstrate their the learning outcomes in a way that's personal and best to them. That's for sure. I think that the difficulty is making sure that students, faculty, in particular, have the right support, both in terms of technology and also educationally, to be able to do that. So if you said to someone, we've always assessed this on paper by way of an exam, but you can do an oral presentation, there'll be hundreds of questions from a student. Well, how do I reference it? How long does it need to be? Can I use PowerPoint? Unless you've thought through what that would look like, then it's not going to happen, and no one's going to pick it. And I do know examples of universities who've tried this, and they've said, well, we get a few people doing the alternative assessments, but not very many, because there's nothing for them to compare it to. In the same way that with an exam, you can conceive of what the right answer looks like. It's written, it's there, you'd mark it. It's probably in a model answer and a mark scheme. You kind of need that for your alternatives as well. To say to them, well, it would be a 15-minute presentation. This is where you'd put the references. This is what you can use. This is what the follow-up might be. That gives confidence to both faculty and student to use those alternatives.
I suppose, is there an element of compromise here? I'm just thinking one of the overarching themes you've had over the course of this event has been the pressure that's being put on universities to embed things like skills education in curricula, and the argument for that is also to not just boost outcomes but also avoid the culture shock of graduates entering the workplace. Is there perhaps a third way with assessment where you can embed those kind of skills into the assessment. So by picking a type of assessment for a type of course, you will get students better prepared for what their career of choice is going to look like, or what just the adjustments of the workplace is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right, and I have real sympathy for faculty around the country, around the world, because this is a theme that comes up time and again, and it's easier in some areas than others. I mean, only a small proportion of people who take a law degree become a lawyer, but it's much easier to map this idea of a law module having a assessment that looks and feels practical. There are other areas where that's not the case. If you're in a humanities subject, to say, well, let's make this practical. What does that mean? That the gamut of jobs that people are going to potentially do afterwards is huge. If we, though, however, sort of reduce it down and say, well, instead of saying that you'd sit an exam with no reference to any material and you do that in silence for 3 hours, that's not what you're going to be doing in life. Very much let's steer into the skid. Let's say, well, you can use what you like. You can, it may be an exam, it may be a coursework, but you can reference what you like, because you will, in the real world, almost certainly have access to almost everything. You're not going to be in situations where you have, blinkers on, no ability to reference anything. So maybe that's the reality that we can bring in and move away from the idea that the way of assessing people is just an exam where we ask them to hold a lot in their mind, and we're as much testing their memory as we are their ability and their application.
Great, thank you. There's another question about the sort of the transition that digital assessment offers, and it asks, what can we do different, or something that might be exciting and a real change. Learning out and measure learning outcomes in a different way. Much digital assessment is often a translation between media.
Yes, and I think that in many cases, the first level of digital assessment is simply to digitize your paper, and that's it. And it just happens to be on a computer. What can we do that's differently? I think we can give people access to all of the things that they use day to day. So embedding people's use of word processing, spreadsheets, presentation software, making it like the sorts of things that they do in their normal learning environment. That's a first step. The second is the one of the great things you get from digital is the ability for people to collaborate quite easily. Let's where there's space to do that, allowing students to collaborate, given that that's taking the previous question, what they're going to do in the world that they're going to enter post university. These are all small steps that we can take, which I'm sure will then lead to people thinking, aha, okay, well, in my subject, there's also a little bit more that I can do. I don't think we should rush to this sort of end state of the perfect assessment, because we won't get there. Let's make those initial gradual changes, move away from some of the norms we've had, and they will themselves lead to further innovation.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, which is a shame because we've got a couple of really good ones. I'm just trying to choose which is the. Okay, one topic we haven't spoken about is addressing misconduct, academic and student misconduct in digital assessment. So perhaps to wrap up, we could just clarify what advice you give in order to avoid both of those things.
Okay, so very briefly then, my advice is that you tell students very, very clearly what the digital assessment system can do and what you're looking for. I think if you tell people, I'm looking for people who are using their phone while on screen, students who want to make sure that they're not committing misconduct will act appropriately, and the ones who are the very small numbers, at least they've had that flagged up to them. I think it's about giving students as much information as possible. That's not helping them cheat, far from it. It's actually making sure that their behavior is such that you end up with a very small number who might be committing misconduct, and it makes it easier for you to spot that. So don't make it a mystery, be open.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, I think we'll wrap up there. I'm really sorry we didn't get time to get through all the questions. We've had a large amount of engagement. It's just to say this session will be available on demand, so you'll be able to come back and watch it if you require. Also, if you would like any more information about this subject from THE or Inspera, please do get in touch and we'll connect you with the right people. I will now hand back to Hannah. Ishan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair.